At an airbase deep in the Nevada desert, a woman moved quietly through the hangar's shadows, her hands carefully wiping every cold steel curve of the Apache AH-64's 30mm cannon. She made no sound, asked for no attention, part of the landscape, like a shadow trailing the first light of day. Sleeves rolled high, eyes always lowered, she was just a technician, faded and easily forgotten. Until a battle-hardened pilot walked by and caught a glimpse of the tattoo hidden beneath her collar, an ancient jet-black emblem almost too unreal to exist. His eyes changed from indifferent to stunned. Rumors spread like wildfire. Command began to appear. A few veterans quietly stepped back. The younger ones gave small nods without knowing why. But she did not stop. She did not look up. She kept wiping the dust from the cannon as if nothing had happened. Where in the world are you watching this video from? If this story awakens something in your heart, hit subscribe. We still have many memories that have never been told. Dawn had just brushed the edge of the Nevada desert, its light thin as a blade cutting across the dark sky of the night before. On the hardened ground of Nellis Air Force Base, the few drops of dew shattered under the first footsteps of the new day. And at that moment, Riley Drake appeared quiet, punctual, just as she had every morning for the past 8 months. No sound announced her. She moved through rows of slumbering aircraft like a shadow, pushing her familiar toolbox, shoulders hunched slightly forward to block the desert wind pressing against her collar. No one waited for her. No one expected her. She expected nothing either. The Apache AH-64 parked at the far end of Hangar 4 had become her silent domain. Every morning Riley arrived earlier than her shift, while others were still brewing coffee or stretching in their bunks, so she could touch this machine of war without interruption. She bent down, flipped open the steel panel, and began disassembling the M230 cannon with the practiced movements of someone who not only mastered the craft but knew each detail as intimately as her own breath. No notes needed. No hesitation. Her body remembered every sequence. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward the hangar entrance, not because she expected someone, but because vigilance had been carved into her very skin. The heart of a soldier who had passed through many bases never truly rested, even when she was oiling a gun barrel. The world around her had not yet awakened. The air still carried the chill of the night before, drifting quietly through the tall glass frames. The first rays of sunlight pierced through, catching motes of dust suspended like a silent dance. Every morning, Riley was there for that moment, as if it were a ritual she kept for herself alone. But then, as always, the rhythm of the base began to quicken. Metal doors clanged open. Boots struck the floor. Loud laughter bounced off the hangar walls. A group of young technicians spilled in, chattering as they dragged tool carts. A red-haired boy nudged his friend, gestured toward Riley, and whispered loud enough for the whole group to hear. "Good morning, machine gun witch," he said, half joking, half admiring. The others laughed, the sound echoing against the sheet metal roof. Riley did not react. She didn't look up. She didn't frown. She simply kept cleaning the recoil spring as if the words had never existed. For a fleeting second, her sleeve rode up, revealing a small tattoo just beneath the nape of her neck. A sharp, black curve etched into sun-browned skin. A few saw it, but no one asked. Because here, people knew not to ask questions no one dared to answer. At lunch, she ate alone at the back table. A sergeant nearly sat down beside her, then thought better of it, moving elsewhere. In the supply depot, when she turned in her request for spare parts, an officer stepped ahead, ignoring her obvious presence. The clerk did the same. Riley stepped back, still holding her form. Her eyes free of reproach, she simply withdrew into her shadow. Back at the hangar, she found Captain Callum Greaves, new, young, and eager to prove himself, waiting with a clipboard in hand. "Drake, I need that cannon running perfectly by 1400, he said, eyes fixed on the papers. "And this time, don't leave any issues behind." She did not argue. She didn't need to. because no technical error had ever borne her name. Greaves didn't know that, or didn't care. He walked off briskly, leaving Riley standing in the hangar that was growing louder by the minute. She exhaled softly, rolling her sleeves higher. The tattoo revealed itself more clearly, a design too intricate, too ancient to be a random choice. But no one noticed. Or not yet. Another morning like any other. But sometimes, it is within repetition that fate chooses to change everything. Do you think a tattoo can tell the story of an entire buried past? Don't look away, because the real secret hasn't even begun to surface. While other areas paused to rest or complained about meals that felt like they'd been airdropped since the Korean War, Riley Drake remained by the Apache. The aircraft had all but become her most silent companion. It asked no questions, never interrupted, and showed no pity. Each time Riley opened a panel, loosened a bolt, or wiped away soot, it was as if she were erasing something from her mind. Something old, rooted deeper than anyone could imagine. Not everyone knew where she had been before Nellis. Official records listed a few small bases, technical assignments, a spotless record. But something didn't quite fit in that too quiet picture. Like a photo that had been over-edited looked real, but lacked depth. Some colleagues whispered that Riley wasn't like ordinary maintenance staff. The way she read circuit diagrams, as if flipping through a familiar novel. The way she looked at jamming devices, not with the eyes of a technician, but as someone who had once used them differently. She never boasted, but she knew exactly which antenna could interfere with low-orbit satellite signals. Once, when the base monitoring system malfunctioned, Riley said nothing, just walked quietly to the control panel, pressed a few buttons, then announced the system would reset in 90 seconds, and it did. Precisely to the second. The official IT staffer standing beside her could only offer an awkward laugh, as if he had just witnessed a miracle. Even so, Riley never revealed anything outright. She lived by a strange principle. Never do more than what she was assigned, but always perform better than anyone expected. Her precision reassured others, but carried something unsettling, as if she were programmed, not raised. And then there were the small, repeated details, like how she never sat with her back to the door, or how she always checked the placement of security cameras when entering a meeting room. No one thought much of it, but those who had known the battlefield recognized it. These were not the habits of a mere technician. Once, Riley walked past a group of young soldiers mopping the floor while they quizzed each other on military security questions on their phones. One of them turned, squinting. "Hey Drake, want to try?" "Just some radio frequency ID stuff." She tilted her head, glanced at the screen for a moment, then pointed at a string of code and said, "That pattern belongs to a jamming band. It's used to blanket GPS signals, not satellites." The answer was so exact it left the whole group speechless. Riley didn't smile. She simply walked away, as if she'd just described how to fill a fuel tank. But anyone truly paying attention would notice something else. Sometimes, Riley froze when the hangar radio broadcasted a news report on warfare. Especially when Afghanistan was mentioned, she would stand still for a few seconds, eyes unblinking, before resuming. Brief, but enough to know that place was not unfamiliar to her. Once, a sergeant carelessly asked, "Have you ever been to the Middle East?" Riley didn't reply. But in that instant, her eyes seemed to age several years. She had been there, perhaps not as a technician, perhaps not under the name she now carried. And then, one afternoon, nothing particularly special, as sunlight spilled into the hangar floor like liquid honey, Riley shed her outer jacket to work on the underside of the cannon. Her back revealed part of a tattoo, dark, sharp, a black raven, wings spread, entwined with coded military symbols. Just one glance was enough to make an old veteran standing several meters away freeze, lips moving but no words forming. He didn't ask. He just looked at her, for a long time, then quietly turned away. Perhaps he had seen that emblem before. Perhaps he knew those who bore it had never returned after the Sahel campaign. And Riley? She did not turn her head. She stayed bent low, silently tightening the last bolt, as if the tattoo had never existed. Dear viewers, take a sip of water and keep listening. The story has even more unexpected turns ahead. Comment 1 if you think this story is worth hearing, so we know you're still with us. The simulated alarm blared through the maintenance room, tearing apart the afternoon's heavy silence. In an instant, Riley Drake snapped out of her trance. Red warning lights flashed across the monitors, signaling a critical breach. A vital signal encryption system was under attack, and mission failure was at its highest threat level. Without anyone needing to say a word, Riley knew she could no longer stand still. She picked up a signal reader combined with a technical tool, a device used only by special operations units, and moved toward the main control panel. Her hands worked the instrument with calm precision, as if she were tuning an ancient piece of music. On the screen, command lines began to shift speed. Warning colors changed from red to yellow, then to green. The system started to recover, the data decrypted, and the signal attack was erased before it could escalate into real alarm status. As the engineers and staff around her realized it was over, they turned to her with eyes filled with both shock and respect. But Riley, like a wolf wearing the guise of an ordinary human, showed no flair. She quietly detached the device, wiped her hands on the optical tube, and resumed her tasks with the same efficiency as any other morning, as if nothing had happened. At that moment, Captain Marcus Hawk Brennan, the one who had once paused in disbelief at the sight of her tattoo, stepped into the operations bay. He had never seen anyone neutralize a major technical breach that quickly, especially not a quiet technician. A veteran soldier murmured as he watched Riley at work. She moves like she's guided by a sharper vision no one else can see, before wondering what truths she was concealing. Now, the tattoo was no longer just a small secret between two shifts. It had become a clue hinting at an entire unwritten chapter of the past. Riley remained silent, but some people began to notice, reevaluating that quiet girl from a new angle. Someone placed a hand on the console beside her and whispered, silent yet powerful, like a storm waiting to break. Riley's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not friendly, but like that of a warrior biding her time before emerging from the shadows. The tattoo remained where it was, hidden beneath her collar. Some caught sight of its edges and looked away, others turned aside as if they knew it wasn't something to discuss lightly. But from that moment on, every glance at her carried a new weight. Riley had no idea how many had secretly committed the black emblem to memory, for it was more than a tattoo. It was a declaration of origin, a mark of someone who had lived at the edge of every untold story, yet carried the responsibility of saving an entire system when truth was denied. The maintenance room gradually returned to its calm. She stayed at her post working, checking the stability of the cannon, not a flicker of pride in her expression. Strangely enough, the longer people observed, the more they realized. Sometimes, it is the quietest one who keeps the entire battlefield standing, while all the noise fades into history. And if Riley hadn't saved the base, would you ever have guessed that instead of just a technician, she was a living trace of a military past thought to be erased? Can you guess what she is hiding? Something stronger than maintenance skills? And when silence finally falls, what will erupt next? The air inside the hangar felt strange. It was impossible to capture precisely the way the group looked at Riley Drake as she stood still beside the war machine, like a layer of sediment exposed after half a century of silence. Those who once ignored her now turned, throats dry as if swallowing sand, because they were beginning to realize the quiet woman who maintained the Apache was not just skilled, she was beyond the scope of a technician. Captain Brennan, the one who had once stood frozen at the sight of her tattoo, felt respect rising within him. Some craned their necks, staring openly, then pretended to look away. They didn't know what to say. because that ordinary disciplined presence had suddenly transformed into the clearest symbol of courage. As the tension gradually subsided, engineers, pilots, and maintenance officers began to gather. Someone hesitated, then spoke, voice trembling slightly. Do you know what we just witnessed?" Riley gave no verbal answer. She simply set her tool down, wiped her hands, and paused, her gaze firm, carrying the steel of a soldier, enough to make even a plastic pin bow its head. Silence was the strongest reply. Days later, Riley still reported for duty as usual. But no one called her Machine Gun Witch anymore. Instead, when she passed, quiet whispers followed. Ghost Raven, the one who saved the base from blackout. Invisible, yet impossible to miss. The shift from unseen to noticed was quiet but heavy with weight. An old sergeant, a man who had fought in many places, clapped a comrade on the shoulder. "That's not just technique," he said, with a half-smile touched by sorrow. "That's the soul of the battlefield." Riley felt every gaze lingering on her, yet she continued following the rhythm she had built for months, checking the gun, calibrating the cannon, confirming error margins. Only this time, her hands were steadier because she was no longer invisible. For the first time in months, she smiled unintentionally, a smile that required no effort. Gentle, yet enough to make a young officer avert his eyes, fumbling for an excuse to get back to work so he wouldn't have to face her directly. It was the smile of a warrior finally seen, not loud, but quietly piercing. And then, during the afternoon pilot training, as Riley walked through the hangar in a clean uniform, an officer deliberately slowed his pace to let her pass, standing still as he said, "Thank you, Riley, for everything." Not elaborate, but heavy with meaning. She gave a small nod. Recognition required no long words. Even Captain Brennan, who was not fond of emotional displays, paused beside the Apache, looking at the maintenance schedule Riley had left, and murmured, "I used to think I understood everything about the battlefield. Now, I know I was wrong." Riley smiled faintly, meeting his eyes. She didn't speak, but her gaze said, "The greatest parts of who we are don't need to be told in words." In the following days, the tattoo began to step out of the shadows. A few sharp-eyed technicians recognized the Ghost Raven emblem that had once been the insignia of a rear-line squadron erased after a notorious failed mission. If Riley had belonged to that unit, then every perspective on her had to change. One afternoon, the head of the technical division pulled Riley aside and quietly asked, "Do you want to tell us some of it?" Riley only shook her head, her tattoo hidden. But her eyes opened a door, the door many were waiting to step through. Instead of pressing her, the division rescheduled maintenance shifts so more people could work alongside her. Pilots no longer brushed past as if she were invisible. Engineers no longer ignored her at the dining table. That night, someone left a sweet cup of coffee, no name, no note, perhaps only to say a silent thank you. And finally, for the first time, Riley felt what was called community, not because she wielded technology, but because she had used silence to preserve the drop of pride that might otherwise have dried away if no one remembered. Can you feel the power of simply being present at the right time, in the right way? And if someone like Riley were suddenly invisible, no longer, what would happen next? The evening light dissolved across the hangar, scattering faint reflections on the steel curves of the Apache as Riley Drake stepped forward into the circle of her colleagues. Every gaze turned toward her, not as if she were a shadow forgotten, but as if she were a living emblem of loyalty and resolve. A retired sergeant who once stared at an old photo of the Ghost Raven unit Riley had once served with stood silently by the technical dossier. His eyes lingered on the tattoo now hidden beneath her uniform, yet piercing through the fabric, as if to say, "I know who you are." No grand gestures followed. There were no loud cheers, no embellished praise. Instead, the weight of recognition came in smaller acts. A hand resting lightly on Riley's shoulder, a respectful nod from a young pilot, an older man's quiet vow of acknowledgement. Someone discreetly placed a fixed headset into the nearby drawer, as if to wordlessly affirm that Riley was no longer just an anonymous maintainer. She had entered this life in silence, but now she received respect in the warmth of camaraderie. A passing engineer lifted a hand in a subtle tap salute, the way pilots acknowledge each other before a mission. It wasn't flashy, but it was an admission. You are still Ghost Raven. In the break room, whispers spread that the Raven insignia, the legendary mark of an elite unit once thought of as myth, now lived not only on her skin, but pulsed through every step she took. They compared Riley to an actual Raven, always flying through silence, seeing what others overlooked, returning not to be seen but to protect. One technical officer pulled Riley aside by the campaign map and muttered softly, not wanting others to hear, "If you ever take leave, we'll be lost for a few minutes." The comment sparked laughter, for after weeks of her silence, Riley had somehow become indispensable. It was a small jolt that woke everyone to the truth. Sometimes, the quietest person is the one no one can do without. Amid these changes, Captain Brennan, the one who had once been transfixed by her tattoo, sat beside Riley's table one evening. He brought her a glass of cold water, the soldier's courteous gesture, and spoke in a low voice. "I sense something bigger than all the technical talk happening here." Riley said nothing, only accepted the glass. But her silence was admission enough. She had not only safeguarded the base, she had preserved a part of its spirit. Days later, a note appeared on Riley's toolbox, no name, only a slanted handwritten line. Not just a technician, the one who brought Ghost Raven back. Riley stared at the note, her eyes lifting as though for the first time she felt truly seen. By the week's end, during the routine operations briefing, Captain Greaves, once indifferent, called for silence. He hesitated, then spoke. "I want to acknowledge a comrade, someone we overlooked, but who today has made this entire base stand united." No name was spoken. Yet all eyes turned toward Riley, and a round of applause rose unspoken, yet louder than any words, the first in months. Riley placed her hand along the cannon, not rushing, not retreating. The machine was no longer just the old bird in the corner of the hangar, but the centerpiece of an unspoken story she had told of loyalty, silence, and strength from within. She walked out of the hangar, her shoulders no longer bent. It was her way of honoring the past, not as Lieutenant Ghost Raven on parade, but with a simple presence that was enough to make everyone feel safe in the dark, knowing someone stood quietly to guard them. Do you believe a silent act can change how people see you? And if she is still carrying an unfinished mission, what will her next step be? As sunset gently tinged the sky over Carson Hill, Riley Drake was no longer a shadow within the base. She stood on the runway, her outer jacket closed, concealing the black raven tattoo, yet the last light of the day still caught its hidden outline like a quiet reminder that the past could never remain frozen forever. Today, she was no longer invisible. She was a living emblem, a silent affirmation of loyalty and the ability to rise amid chaos. The Apaches lined up on both sides like soldiers awaiting orders. The soft hum of engines starting up rose in the air, like a subtle push urging Riley forward. She walked to the end of the runway, her shoulders no longer hunched, her eyes sweeping across each aircraft, each soldier beneath the dimming lights. Here, the Raven symbol was no longer just a hidden tattoo, it was the living sign of a story yet unfinished. A pilot running pre-flight checks glanced back at Riley, giving her a look that said, "That's the one who made tonight's mission possible." No words of thanks, yet the look carried more than enough. Nearby, a simple note had been left behind. Without Raven, there would be no flight training tonight. No flourish, no fanfare, but enough to make Riley smile. a quiet smile, as clear as the twilight itself. As Riley paused beside an Apache readying for departure, Captain Brennan appeared. He watched the sunset reflecting off the cockpit glass, then turned toward her. He said nothing, but in his eyes, both solemn and softened, Riley understood. She had become the one the entire base could trust. The light faded. The helicopters lifted off one by one, leaving behind a widening space filled with the echo of engines and the blinking runway lights. Riley stood at the center, silent, exhaling gently. For the first time, it seemed, she no longer needed silence just to exist. That night's flight order map was tucked into her sleeve, and beneath it, the raven tattoo briefly surfaced as she bent light, grazing the hidden artery of her past, only to be covered again. A symbol not only of survival, but of the beginning of something greater. Riley pulled out the small signal bell, struck it with a clear ding, the cue for the final helicopter to take off. Someone chuckled softly. An officer remarked, "She just gave the go for launch, and now everything is secure." Not jubilant, simply full of hope. The day ended, but the story did not. The raven tattoo was no longer locked away. Instead, it spoke quietly to anyone willing to look deeper. Trust the one you cannot see, for they are the ones holding you steady when you don't even know it. Have you ever thought that what remains unseen might be what keeps us safe? And if Raven's mission is truly not over yet, what will she do next? There are people who pass through our lives quietly, like Riley Drake, never needing praise, never demanding attention. Yet, it is they, the ones who silently protect, uphold, and keep the world running in peace, who end up shaping the greatest things of all. Her story reminds us that honor does not always reside in medals or ceremonies, but sometimes in a glance, a gesture silent, yet unyielding. If you have ever felt forgotten, or found yourself walking through the shadows, remember, you may be the raven in someone else's story. Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey. If this story touched you, leave a comment, share your own story, or simply say thank you to someone quiet who has been there in your life. And don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss more human-centered military stories like this one. We are always here telling the tales that have never been told.